Hello everyone, my name is Toby Altman. I'm the new director of the RCAH Center for Poetry and also a professor at RCAH. And I'm a poet and a scholar, and above all, I'm somebody who really believes in poetry as a communal act. So I'm really excited to be here and really excited to foster that kind of community at RCAH and at MSU and in the Lansing poetry world more broadly.
How did your love of literature and poetry begin, and why do you love it so much?
Yeah, so earlier I was talking about how I believe that poetry is really a communal art and how that's really important to me to foster as the director of the RCAH Center for Poetry. And my life as a poet really began in that kind of communal space. So when I was a kind of early teenager, like 12, 13 years old, my father got interested in poetry and he would take me to open mics in the neighborhood where he lived in Chicago. And I met a lot of people who were also poets through that, and they encouraged me and supported me and just made it feel kind of possible that poets were human beings and that you could have a life in poetry. And so that was kind of my first step into the poetry world, was attending those readings and performing at them. And I think that's one of the real goals of the RCAH Center for Poetry, is we want to bring poetry to RCAH and to MSU and show people that it's a living art, and that it's something that they can be part of and they can participate in. It's not this unattainable, really distant thing.
I think you wrote on your website that you're very interested in architecture and how it kind of connects to culture and society and stuff like that. And would you want to tell us a bit more about that interest?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in kind of an architectural family. My mother worked in architects' offices doing kind of PR and grant writing and things like that. And so I grew up in architects' offices. And more than that, I grew up in Chicago and traveling around the city. My mother would sort of tell me about the city's architecture as we traveled. So the kind of texture of architecture as part of life is something that is really intimate to my experience of the world, kind of foundational to my experience of the world. And after I finished my first book, and as I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, the hospital that I was born in, Prentice Women's Hospital, was demolished by Northwestern University, where I was doing my Ph.D. And so I was getting these there was a preservation fight over the hospital, and I was getting these updates from the university about its battle with the preservationists at 3 in the morning. It was very strange. And they were all very positive. The university was very excited that it was winning this fight and could tear down this architectural landmark that was intimately connected to my my personal history and my connection to Chicago as a place. And I don't think I would have articulated it in these terms at that point, but I think I realized intuitively or emotionally that architecture was a really interesting place to work because it links together so many different spheres. It's an aesthetic practice, it's an art into itself, so there are really interesting artistic questions that are going on in architecture. It's also a social practice, right? Architecture is something that houses people, that keeps them warm, that shelters them from the elements. And so it reflects the kind of society that we want to have, or that we do have and don't want to have. So it's a kind of library of society, or a library of society's ambitions for itself. So architecture became that for me, and I embarked on this 3-book project, writing about various Midwestern architects and their buildings and things like that, and I'm, maybe midway through the 3rd book at this point, coming toward the end of the 3rd book, and I don't know what I'll do after that, but I'm sure I'll think of something. But it's been a really fun and a really interesting, sustained project. I mean, I've been working on this project now for 10 years. Yeah, I started in the fall of 2014 on the first of the 3 books, Discipline Park. So I think by the time I'm done, it probably will represent 12 or 15 years of my career.
What is kind of the hardest part about writing a book, or maybe just writing in general?
All of it. Yeah, no, it's all hard.
Yeah.
It never gets easier. But I think the difficulty is part of the point, right? It's not, if you're not holding yourself to a high standard, you're not going to write something that's worth reading, right? I don't want to give people a complex or something like that. It's important to let yourself play, it's important to let yourself write badly, it's important to just kind of explore what you're thinking in your journal, and I do a lot of that, and I do a lot of really bad writing. But I think once you start trying to trying to take the pieces of that and put them together into something that really matters, you do want to hold yourself to an exacting standard so that you're saying exactly what you need to say. You're not accepting anything which is less than what you need to say. You have to cultivate a certain ruthlessness in regard to your own writing in order to write something really good. You have to be willing to sacrifice things that you love for the good of the poem or the good of the book. And that's a hard thing to do, and it really just takes time. Like, you just have to give yourself the time to see things clearly, to separate yourself from what you've written. It's a humbling experience, I think. Yeah, I think you really have to learn to let go of your own ego and let the poem do what it needs to do, right, and not get in its way. So anyway, it's in the end it's very fun and very satisfying, but in the moment it often feels very difficult. And I think it's important to say that. Like, I think it even when you're like a quote unquote successful writer or a published writer, it's not like it feels easier or like you just sit down and write something beautiful the first try. Like, it is work. It takes hard work.
Yeah.
But it's a worthwhile work to do.
Do you have any specific writing process or anything like that, anything that inspires you or that you start with every single time you start writing?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I think it depends on what sort of level or scale of writing you're talking about. So when I'm just kind of generating material, I often do so by like reading a book and having my notebook open, and something in the book kind of prompts me or gets me started. I think that's really good practice. Like, reading other people's poems kind of takes your mind to places that it wouldn't otherwise go, and takes you a little bit outside yourself. I also have done a lot of kind of embodied, sort of in-person writing, where I will, because I write about architecture, I'll go to see a specific building and I'll sort of write about the trip as I'm taking it, and then write about the experience of being near the building and in relationship to it. And when I'm traveling around and visiting buildings, I'll see something on the train, or I'll overhear somebody say something, and it'll be sort of a strange and beautiful thing that kind of enters into the poem. I'll give you an example. When I was living in Iowa City, I was at like a UPS store, and I was like finishing up the transaction, and the guy behind the counter was like, "Okay, let your credit card marinate in the machine now." And I was like, "There's no way I'm not putting that into a poem." That's absolutely going into a poem. But I would have never put it into the poem if I were not sort of out in the world listening to what people were saying, and sort of inviting the world into the poem in some way. I think that's a really different vision of the poet than what you get in kind of stereotypes in popular culture. Like, we're not hanging out in like ivory towers looking at the stormy sea, like feeling deep feelings. We're like out in the world talking to people and reading and thinking about things. And poetry is a kind of art of engagement with the world around you, rather than this kind of isolated, abstruse thing. You've
been giving kind of advice throughout this entire interview, but is there any other kind of advice you would give to beginner poets or to writers that are simply like starting out?
Finding your community is a big one. I think the other thing that's been a thread throughout the conversation is reading poetry is really good and really helpful, because reading other people's poems expands your sense of what is possible in the art. So it expands the kind of horizons in which you can work. So reading really widely, reading really omniversely, I think is a really good idea for somebody who's just starting out.
Lastly, is there anything you kind of would like to say to kind of begin your position as the director for the Center for Poetry?
My vision for the Center for Poetry is that it's a very collaborative place, it's a very inclusive place, it's a place where students feel like they can drop in anytime and chat with Laurie or chat with me about poetry or about anything else that's going on in their lives. A place where students feel like their voices are heard and their priorities are attended to. I'm hoping that students will shape the programming that we do, and that we'll be able to bring people to campus who really matter to ARCA students and to MSU students. And so I want the Center for Poetry to be a place that's not kind of dictatorial or something like that, where I'm sort of saying this is what we do and who we are, but really a kind of place of conversation and exchange where poetry comes to life. And I mean that in the sense, we've been talking about poetry as kind of communal art, communal practice. I want this to be one of the places where that communal capacity of poetry is made actual and is realized. So when I talk about bringing poetry to campus and bringing poetry to ARCA, I'm not just thinking about bringing poets and bringing poems, but also bringing that kind of spirit of collaboration and community engagement to the work that we do, so that people feel included and respected and welcome, and feel like the center really reflects the needs that they have to make their art grow and to grow as students and as human beings.